Please welcome Vice President Joe Biden.
Good afternoon, folks. Thank you for being here. 6 months ago, here in New York City, I made the case that Donald Trump was dangerously incompetent and incapable of world leadership. And the past few days, in the wake of the killing of the Iranian General Soleimani, I think Donald Trump has proven beyond that comment beyond dispute. The haphazard decision-making process that led up to it, the failure to consult with our allies or Congress, and the reckless disregard for the consequences that would surely follow was, in my view, dangerously incompetent. And folks, in wake of such an enormous escalation that has exploded geopolitics in the region and put the United States and Iran on a collision course, what would we expect from an American president? Well, what have we heard from President Trump? We have not heard a sober-minded explanation to reassure the American people that this decision and its consequences were thought through. No level-headed words meant to dial down the tensions and to take us off the path of conflict. No press conference or consultation with our Congress. No, what we've heard so far from this president are tweets, threats, and tantrums. All we've heard from this administration are shifting explanations, evasive answers, repeated assertions of an imminent threat without the necessary evidence to support that conclusion. And since this is a president with the history of lying about virtually everything, who has destroyed his own credibility and that of the United States on the global stage, neither the American people nor our allies, and indeed no one around the world seems to be taking his word for it. If there was an imminent threat that required this extraordinary action, we're owed an explanation and the facts to back it up. But these matters are of deadly import. And to me, they are unmistakably clear. Donald Trump does not have, let me make it clear, does not have the authority to go to war with Iran without congressional authorization. Without working with Congress, it is not optional. It is not an optional part of his job. Presidential notification of Congress about the need to exercise war powers cannot be satisfied in 280 characters or less. And no president should ever take the United States to war without securing the informed consent of the American people. You know, because he refuses to level with the American people about the dangers which he has placed American troops and our diplomatic corps, personnel and civilians as well as our partners and allies, or demonstrated even a modicum of presidential gravitas, I will attempt to do that. That starts with an honest accounting of how we got where we are. Make no mistake that this outcome is a strategic setback, heightened threats, chance of death to America, once more echoing across the Middle East. Iran and its allies are vowing revenge that was unavoidable. The seeds of danger were planted by Donald Trump himself on May the 8th, 2018, the day the president tore up the nuclear deal against the advice of his own top national security advisors, the day he turned his back on our closest European allies and decided it was important to him to destroy any progress made by the Obama-Biden administration, then build on it and create a better, safer world. When we had an Iran deal, we had verifiability. Cut off every one of Iran's pathways to a nuclear weapon. International inspectors repeatedly confirmed Iran's compliance, as did our own intelligence agencies, with that agreement. And one of the greatest threats to the stability of the region and global security was off the table: Iranian nuclear power. And when the Iran deal was in force, we didn't have this dangerous cycle of tit-for-tat provocation and response. There was a united front of allies and partners to address Iran's other destabilizing actions throughout the region. The Iran deal was not only accomplishing a critical mission that it was designed for, it also created an environment where diplomacy was possible. But Trump, he walked away. Not Iran, Trump walked away. Trump made the United States the international outlier. Trump reimposed significant sanctions designed to exert, quote, maximum pressure on the regime, with claims that it would, in fact, deter Iranian aggression and return Iran to the negotiating table to secure a much-promised, quote, better deal. And on both fronts, as many anticipated at the time, Trump's promises were empty, baseless, and naive. And since then, all that has materialized is utterly predictable, a predictable cycle of escalating conflict with Iran. It was stated at the time, of course, Iran would seek to demonstrate that the pressure we were exerting was not cost-free. It could take actions to make life more difficult for us as well. So Iran began again to unearth and enrich uranium beyond the limits allowed under the Iran deal, the nuclear deal. Iran attacked oil tankers in the Straits of Hormuz. It shot down an unmanned U.S. surveillance drone. Yet, the administration had no plan to prevent, mitigate, or appropriately respond to these provocations. Instead, Trump acted erratically and impulsively, which is not unexpected. He ordered a retaliatory strike. Then he called it off at the last minute, feeding Iran's sense of impunity. Then the administration imposed more sanctions, shot down an Iranian drone, issued a warrant to seize the Iranian oil tanker, and before long, Iran attacked Saudi Arabia's facilities, Iran-backed militia in Iraq restarted rocket attacks against our bases, until one of those attacks against our bases in Kirkuk killed a U.S. citizen and wounded others. It was a tragic loss of life and an act condemned by all Americans. But in response, Trump bombed 5 sites in Iraq and Syria tied to the militia group, killing at least 25. Iraq protesters organized by Iran-backed militia assaulted our embassy in Baghdad and breached the outer wall of that compound. No injuries were reported, but Trump was embarrassed by the images of a burnout reception area. He ordered the drone strikes to kill Soleimani, perhaps the second most important official in Iran, near the Baghdad airport as a consequence. And he rushed thousands more troops to the region to deal with the fallout. Action and reaction, provocation and response. All predictable, and indeed all predicted. A president who says he wants to end endless wars in the Middle East is bringing us dangerously close to starting a brand new one. A president who says he wants out of the region sends an additional 18,000 plus troops to deal with a crisis of his own making. An administration that claims its actions have made America safer, in the same breath, urges our citizens to leave Iraq, puts Americans throughout the region on notice because of the increased danger that now exists. I have no illusions about Iran. I never have. The regime has long sponsored terrorism and threatened our interests. It continues to detain American citizens. They've ruthlessly killed hundreds of protesters, and they should be held accountable for their actions. But there's a smart way to counter them, to counter Iran, and a self-defeating way. Trump's approach, in my view, is demonstrably the latter. Soleimani was responsible for the deaths of hundreds of American troops and thousands of innocent lives throughout the region. He was the mastermind, but he was not the whole of the regime or of its capacity to strike back. So the question is, was the reward of removing a bad actor worth the risk of what comes next? We don't have evidence to suggest that Trump or anyone around him thought seriously about that calculus. It's been reported that the Pentagon, which has long warned against taking a shot like this, was shocked that Trump would take such a risk. That's been the reports. I can't verify that. But it's not a question of whether Iran will retaliate. It almost certainly will. But what it means for our troops, our personnel throughout the region, what it means for our allies and our partners who have troops in harm's way that are impacted by this decision, what it will mean for the long-term mission to counter Iran and prevent ISIS from bouncing back, and our military to pursue broader strategic aims in the region. Already we're seeing the fallout. Iran has declared it will no longer abide by the constraints set up by the nuclear deal, putting it back on track to obtain material for a nuclear weapon and pushing the region closer to a nuclear crisis. You know, our forces in Iraq and Syria are now focused on protecting themselves, preparing to leave, putting the counter-ISIS mission on hold, and allowing a deadly terrorist organization the room to regroup and reactivate. The Iran Parliament voted to eject all Americans and coalition forces from the country. And however you may feel about American military presence in the Middle East, there's a right way and a wrong way to draw down our troops, our troop presence. Getting unceremoniously kicked out is unequivocally the wrong way. And if we do end up having to leave, that would be another boon for Iran, tipping the balance of power in the region in their favor. Where just weeks ago, there were spontaneous protests across Iran against the regime, has taken that pressure off the regime now. Trump's impulsive decision may well do more to strengthen Iran's position in the region than any of Soleimani's plots would have ever accomplished. You know, whether or not we see more or less life, more or less threats, more interest in the area, it's always, and now a debacle. And what is possibly the most dangerous time in recent American history, and precisely the moment when we should be rallying our allies to stand beside us and hold the line against threats, Donald Trump, short-sighted America First dogmatism has come home to roost. Our closest allies are calling for restraint and making a moral equivalence between Iran and the United States. I never thought I'd see that happen coming out of NATO. And China and Russia are quietly reveling in the prospect the United States will now once again be bogged down in another major conflict in the Middle East, giving them room. They'd love nothing more than to be able to continue to pursue their own interest and carve out their own spheres of influence without the United States challenging them on human rights, on abusive trade practices, on meddling in other nations' democracies, because we're too busy in Iran. We are alone now. We're alone and we'll have to bear the cost of Donald Trump's folly. And at this moment, it seems to me, when we most feel the lack of functioning national security process or any investment in diplomacy, we have to do something. After 3 years of hollowing out the State Department, disrespecting and dismissing our intelligence community, destroying the relationship between the White House and Capitol Hill, throwing out the deliberate policy-making process that has served Republicans and Democratic administrations for decades, corroding the values of the word of the United States, abusing our allies, embracing dictators, creating, not solving foreign policy crises on the international stage. We're in a much worse position to meet the demands of this crisis than we were when President Obama and I left office. You know, President Trump has no strategy here, it seems to me. He has no end game. And here's the hardest truth of all. His constant mistakes and poor decision-making have left us, the United States, with a severely limited slate of options for how to move forward. And most of those options are now bad. But there are some key steps that any responsible commander-in-chief would take. And while I don't expect Donald Trump to listen to me, I hope we'll listen to those around him who understand the gravity of the threats we now face. He should take the necessary steps to protect our forces and ensure the security of our diplomats, civilians, and overseas facilities, not just in the Middle East, but anywhere that Iran might be able to strike. He should ensure the federal authorities are working with state and local governments and private institutions to guard against heightened risk of cyber attacks. He should stop tweeting so he doesn't box us in with these threats such that only options left for Iran are increasingly damaging strikes and counterstrikes. And he should immediately, and I hope he's doing this now, but I've heard none of it, he should be immediately reaching out to our European partners and others and send private signals of deterrence and de-escalation to Iran and find a way to avoid the onrush of war. And the best way to do that, of course, would be for President Trump to rejoin the Iran deal and build on it. If Iran moves back in compliance with the obligations and reestablishes international consensus about how to confront these threats in Iran, we'll be much, much better off. The only way out of this crisis is through diplomacy. Clear-eyed, hard-nosed diplomacy grounded in a strategy that's not about one-off decisions and one-upsmanship. Diplomacy that's designed to de-escalate the crisis, protect our people, and secure our regional interests, including our counter-ISIS campaign. No one wants war, but it's going to take hard work to make sure we don't end up there by accident. And finally, and this one's not optional, Mr. President, you have to explain your decision and your strategy to the American people. That's your job as president, Mr. President. Not dear leader, not supreme leader. Democracy runs on accountability. And nowhere is it more important than the power to make war and bring peace. You're required to work with Congress, Mr. President. You're required to abide by the War Powers Resolution, Mr. President. And you cannot pursue war with Iran without consent and authority from Congress. The existing AUMFs, the congressional authorization for use of military force, do not apply. The American people do not want, and our Constitution will not abide, a president who rules by fiat and demands obedience. I served in the executive branch for 8 years. 8 years. And you know, what I find is that I served in that branch also, the other one, the Senate, the Congress, for 36. And I understand better than anyone that the system will not hold unless we find a way to work together to advance our national interest, to work together, not in the political interest of any one party or any one person. We need to restore the balance of powers between the branches of the government. We need checks and balances that actually serve to check and balance the worst instincts of our leaders in either of the branches. We need to use our system to bring us together as a nation, not abuse it and rip us apart. This is not a naive, outdated way of thinking. This is the genius and timelessness of our democratic system, which has, for more than 240 years, allowed us to remake ourselves, reckon with our shortcomings, and move our nation ever forward. That's what we owe these brave women and men who stepped forward to wear the uniform of the United States, who dedicated their life to diplomatic service, who chose to join the Peace Corps, work in development. We represent the best of our country. They represent the best of our country all around the world, and who are today doing so at great risk because of our president. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you all. These are dangerous times, but let me end by saying, may God protect our troops. We need action, Mr. President, and you have to explain what you're doing. Thank you very much.